I'll start whenever you're ready.
All right.
Tell me when to go. No, I'm good. I'm good. You got your recording ready to go?
Yep.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Hello and welcome. I'm Historic Hillsborough Commissioner Rodney Mayo. And I'm so thankful that you could all be here tonight. I must say that I was never really interested in genealogy until coming home from my freshman year at Duke and being told that the stones that became West Campus came from the quarry down the street, and that quarry used to belong to us, the Mayo family. Now, if you know anything about quarries, you know they don't just pop up overnight. Back in 1983, I couldn't really get a straight answer about why no one had ever told me about the quarry or really much of anything about our family's history. Of course, the older folks would talk amongst themselves, but I was too interested in sports and music and girls back then to really listen. I knew my grandmother well. She was a second parent to me, and I knew her siblings, but that was about it. It took me a few decades, but I finally decided to look into our history, and here's what I found. This is our family tree. We used to have an annual Mayo family reunion, something unfortunately COVID spoiled for us. For one of those reunions, my cousin Victoria documented what we would call the immediate family of the house where I grew up, and what all my cousins referred to affectionately as down home. I've listed some of the other family last names that should be familiar to folks in Hillsborough, and I am sure I'm going to get in trouble for leaving a few out. Suffice it to say that for most of Hillsborough's existence, we've been here. Today, I'm going to focus on the base of this tree, my great-grandparents, George and Fanny Mayo. But I can tell you that also hanging from these branches and sub-branches are war heroes, TV stars, and famous athletes. Me, myself, I'm a couple of sub-branches down from Ollie and Jim, the fourth branch from the left there. And sadly, we lost the last living member of this tree, my great-aunt Bernice, only a few years ago. My cousin Bernice still is back there and is named after her. So we're going to start with the interesting story of George. This is George. Well, this is George Thomas Mayo, born here in Hillsborough, most likely in 1831. He lived to see the dawn of the 20th century. I have to say, I wish I had his hat. And this scrawny goatee is my way of channeling his spirit for this presentation. Sometime in the 1990s, this thing called the internet came along, and it made researching things and people a lot easier. One day in the late 90s, I found myself surfing the web when I should have been working, and just popped in George's name. What came across astonished me. Right there in dwelling number 294 of page 173 of Schedule 1 of Free Inhabitants in Hillsborough, North Carolina, is 18-year-old George. Free inhabitants. I cannot tell you how moving it was, and frankly still is, to know that my ancestors had found a way to freedom even before the Civil War. The next thing I noticed was a Betsy Mayo, age 60, in the same household. Nowhere in my family oral history was she mentioned, but a little 21st century research has given me some very believable clues as to who she was. Through Ancestry.com's aggregation of data, I was able to further identify Betsy and her husband, my hypothesized great-great-great-grandfather, Edward Mayo. You can see there, that's where the trail ends at Ancestry. But honestly, as a person of color, I'm very lucky to get this far back. I have to attribute that to them being free people in a place where that was so very uncommon. So of course, the next question for me was, how did they become free? I mean, that couldn't have been easy in 17th century colonial America. I give you Joseph Mayo Esquire, one of many Joseph Mayos, including his nephew, the mayor of Richmond, who surrendered the city to Union troops near the end of the Civil War. His paternal grandfather, William Mayo, founded Richmond. He was the surveyor who drew up the original plans for the city, and he took Chief Powhatan, Pocahontas's father's tribal home, perched high atop Richmond, and made it his own family home. Unfortunately, for this Joe Mayo, he was lost at sea on a voyage back from Lisbon on 24 May 1785. Through some extensive Googling, I found a letter to Thomas Jefferson. Some of you may have heard of him. And then this letter from Jefferson concerning old Joe, among other matters. Jefferson was in France as ambassador at the time, but he did take time to note. And I'm reading from Jefferson's letter here. Besides these, there is an instance since I came away of a young man, Mr. Mayo, who died and gave freedom to all his slaves, about 200. This is about 4 years ago. I shall know how they have turned out. Notwithstanding any discouraging result of these experiments, I am decided on my final return to America to try this one. I shall endeavor to import as many Germans as I have grown slaves. I will settle them with my slaves on farms of 50 acres, each intermingled. So it seems like Jefferson was thinking about giving it a try, albeit with a German twist. To my knowledge, that never actually happened. I was also able to find the will left by Joseph Mayo, and I'll read you a small excerpt. It is my most earnest request that the gentlemen who shall be named executors petition the General Assembly for leave to set free all and every one of the slaves of which I may die possessed, and I entreat my said executors to leave nothing undone which may be requisite to obtain the manumission of the said slaves. Note that it was illegal at this point, but Joe Mayo really had a plan. He put in his will that no one was getting anything if the slaves didn't get free. Well, he must have had some pull, because the Virginia legislature approved a bill on December 13, 1787, freeing all of his slaves. I celebrate December 13th as my personal liberation day because I believe I've identified Edward and his mother Fortune in the property tax records of Joseph Mayo. This is basically all I have on George. I did do the 23andMe DNA test, and I've actually found a DNA connection to the executor of Joseph's will, who by strange happenstance was also the captain of the ship he fell off of on that ill-fated journey back from Lisbon. Now on to Fanny. She is the lovely lady on the right in both of these pictures. Born in 1846, raised and interred here in Hillsborough, North Carolina. And she has a direct connection to this building we are all in right now. Here she is in the 1860 census. What I find interesting is that at this time, she's not living with her parents. She also lived into the early part of the 20th century and died in the home I grew up in. Her parents were James and Eliza Chavis. Eliza was a very, very industrious woman. And among her many jobs was washerwoman right here in the Burwell School. Every time I'm in this place, I think about what she must have seen, heard, endured, and hopefully in some ways enjoyed. Here is Eliza in the 1850 census in dwelling 344, what appears to be a boarding house and a saloon on Churton Street. Mrs. Burwell's diaries tell us a bit more about Eliza. And I encourage all of you to go to the Burwell website and explore the transcribed diaries if you'd like to get a feel for 19th century life in Hillsborough. So I'll admit that when I was voluntold that I would be doing this presentation on my family here, But this was about all I had. But I did take the time to lose my male bias and dig more deeply into Fanny and her mother Eliza's family. And truthfully, I was astonished by what I found. Again, Ancestry.com's aggregation of data from millions of people sharing their oral histories led me to finding Eliza's father and grandfather, Erasmus and Philip Chavis, born respectively in 1768 and 1726. Both born in North Carolina, both died in North Carolina. And Eliza's great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, William Lazarus and Bartholomew Chavis, born in 1706 and 1685, respectively. And Eliza's great-great-great-grandfather, William Early Chavis, born in 1659 in Isle of Wight, Virginia, one of the beginning places of the United States, making him more greats than I can actually put together. I think he's my sixth great-grandfather. So all of this is, pardon the pun, great, but it didn't answer my question about the quarry, the stones that make up the august West Campus of Duke University. Meet Absalom Tatum, patriot, congressman, Revolutionary War hero, and private secretary to Governor Burke. His is the oldest grave in the Raleigh Old Town Cemetery, and he has a pretty impressive resume. Military leader, delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1788, and a member of Congress, among other things. He amassed large land holdings in North Carolina and Tennessee, but had no wife and no legitimate children. These images, or this image, is from the Orange County Register of Deeds website, which provides access to town land records. Now note the dates on the transfers from Mr. Tatum to various Mayos, March 7th, 1861. Also note that there are a few entries with a date of 01/01/1000. Now, if you remember, Absalom Tatum died on 20 December 1802. So it would seem strange to me that he deeded land to various Mayos in 1861. I'm no lawyer, so I guess it's possible to transfer property 59 years after death. What do you guys? Well, here's the actual document, if any of you can read 18th century English. And if you're interested in more details about the transfer of the quarry and surrounding lands to Duke University, I encourage you to watch interviews given by myself and my cousin Beverly Payne in the Telling the Full Story website at visithillsboroughNC.com. In summary, remember, we all come from interesting stories. When I started this journey, I had no idea that I would end up in the Isle of Wight in Virginia in the early 1600s. Talk to the elders in your life. I am now getting so much more information from my mother than I did when I was younger, mainly because I care more about it. Explore your options. I've used Ancestry.com, 23andMe, RootsWeb, many others, and I'll be happy to point you all in the right direction. The internet is your friend. Surf the web. There's all kinds of information out there. And as you can see from my DNA profile, while I've learned a lot about my ancestors, there is still much, much more to know. Any questions? Thank you. Oh, Jeff.
I have a question. So you've lived in Hillsborough your whole life, obviously. At one point, were you a child, when did you realize this amazing historical context around you as a city, and when did you kind of get bit by the urge to really delve deeper into these interests of yours?
Well, it was probably that first weekend I went home after going to college with your wife there and had that conversation with my mom and it triggered me. But then shortly after that, I moved to Boston and I did what most people do when you first go to Boston. I followed the little red line of the history tour and I realized that Hillsborough had comparable timelines to what we all studied as American history. And I was like, wow, I really didn't pay any attention to that when I was growing up.
What about those rocks?
You know, I would be very surprised if the stones leading up to the back door at Burwell School are not from the quarry. I'd be certainly surprised by that. I think again, if you look at that, the website, visit hillsboroughNC.com, we talk a little bit more about it, but at a high level, there was a third party on the behalf of Duke University negotiated the deal with the Mayos. The oral history has it that the final signer was put in jail unjustified manner, so he would sign. So he signed so he couldn't get out of jail, so he could feed his friends. And then I'll leave you with one last piece of oral history that I find extremely interesting. It is about George. He's blind. I don't know if you can tell in the picture here, but oral history tells us that he had a mule, and later in life he was a blacksmith. He would tell that mule, go to Mr. Jones's house. The mule would just head off to Mr. Jones's house. Go to Mr. Smith's house. So he had a mule who understood English. 18th century.
Right, like your dog.
Does your Mayo family cemetery have headstones and have you gained any access to
We
it?
do not have access to it as of yet. There are a few headstones, but not all of them.
Is it just impossible for you to get into that?
We don't have, we need permission.
Yeah,
Mother.
Did you remember that when you went to Duke University, I would tell you to bring a free call, but you didn't know why?
No, I did not know. I thought you just wanted a break.
Then he found out.
I did. I did. I came back and I told Kim and those guys and they're like, what? Well, thank you all for coming. I do encourage you to support the Historic Hillsborough Commission in Burwell School. The website is there available and we are a nonprofit. As well as I'm a member of the Board of Preservation Hillsborough, and we are endeavoring to start a capital campaign to restore Dickerson Chapel Church right down the street, another very, very historic building in Hillsborough. It may be one of the most oldest standing buildings. My understanding it is one of only 2 original courthouse buildings still standing in North Carolina. It was at one point the Baptist church here in Hillsborough. It was also a coffin factory at the end of the Civil War. In 1865, September of 1865, the congregation began raising money to build and buy a freedmen's school with the help of the Philadelphia Society of Friends. How the church started.
Who owns the quarry now?
Duke University.
Did they pay to acquire that?
They paid, well, there was a middleman. He I think it was $5,000 and he sold it for $25,000 a couple of days later. I won't mention this. I met this guy, Bob Olson. His card says, I hunt dead people. If you have any interest or need or want to trace Richmond-based history, he can be very helpful. I met him browsing around Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and he was like, you know what, you look like you need help. Thank you all for coming. I believe we have some refreshments, and what's the plan? What should we do next?
Yes, please, if you would like some refreshments, they're in the next room over. We also have some pamphlets that talk a little bit about the people that Rodney mentioned, who are connected to his family and other enslaved and free Black members of the town of Hillsborough who are connected with the Burwell School. You can also go to our website to learn more about these figures and other students or teachers or members of the community who are connected to this site.
Thank you.